Welcome to the Cambridge Tech Podcast, talking all things technology from the heart of the UK's tech capital. Here are your hosts, Faye Holland and James Parton.
Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Faye.
Welcome back to the second part of our two-part conversation with David Cleevely.
And in this episode, David gives some invaluable advice on the power of networking and how some of the more collaborative organisations he founded are formed very much with this in mind.
And as Faye said last week, if you're new to the podcast, this is a vital conversation to listen to. And if you caught it first time around, you'll no doubt learn something new on a second listen. So welcome to our second part of our conversation with serial entrepreneur David Cleevely. In the first part, which was episode 112, we talked about David's career, the companies he founded and invested in. And in this second part, we're going to delve a little bit deeper into the Cambridge cluster, the vital work David does with government on policy, and one of David's favourite topics that we've touched on a number of times, serendipity and paying it forward.
So David, welcome back, here for round two with us.
Thank you very much, Faye.
So we're going to kick off talking about the Cambridge cluster, like James has said. I think saying that you're passionate about Cambridge is a slight understatement. Listeners will no doubt attest to this. You've been the backbone to so much that we take for granted. So we've talked about Cambridge Angels and lots of the companies in the ecosystem in part one. One of the other things that you instigated that I'd like to start the discussion on today is co-founding Cambridge Network in 1998. So what's the story? Because there's going to be a story, right? What's the story behind co-founding Cambridge Network?
Cambridge Network came out of a number of strands of activity. Herman was very keen on getting investors into Cambridge and wanted to bring analysts to visit so that they could see what was going on firsthand. It turned out that Alec Breurs, who was then the Vice-Chancellor, lived in the same road as me, and occasionally...
It's the street you live on.
It's about 16 houses. I used to, when I was cycling to analysis, quite often I would meet Alec as he was walking into work. And we would have a chat about various things. And it turned out that Alec was very keen on having a bit more of a vision for Cambridge, which I supported. So at analysis, I produced a report with Alec and some others called Cambridge 2020, which at that point was probably about 20 years or so into the future. There was also a dinner at what was now the defunct Cambridge University Local Industry Links. And I brought some Malaysians into Cambridge to take a look round to see what was going on. And everybody was very exercised about these Malaysians wanting to build Cyberjaya and their new thing where, in fact, actually Cambridge was already doing these things. We should be doing something about it, you know. And Herman stood up and said, well, I propose Cambridge 2 as a result of a conversation that he, Alec and I were having at the end of the table. And then I stood up and said, well, we need to do something about networking Cambridge together and so on. And there was a general agreement about that. So suddenly all these things came together, and Herman then put on a dinner at Murray Edwards, then New Hall, at which Fred Hallsworth, of blessed memory, stood up and said, what we need is a marketing czar. And out of that slightly confused conversation came the idea for doing Cambridge Network. And the next meeting we held, which was up on the Science Park, Miranda Weston-Smith had done a whole lot of work, and Herman presented a logo. And always when you've got a logo, you've got an organisation. And away we went. And that meeting had originally, the first one was, 28 people or so, something like that. The second one was 60. The third meeting we had was 120. And the next one we had was about 180 people. There was clearly something in the air, and it just took off. The bit that I did, in particular, was, because I always seem to be the guy with the business model and the governance structure in mind, I thought about how to get this thing off the ground because nobody was going to move first. So I simply said, I'm going to guarantee this £20,000. So if ever anything goes wrong, I have a guarantee of £20,000, I'll back it. And I got Herman and various others then to put in their guarantee of £20,000. There were 5 originally and then 6. Once everybody knew there was a guarantee of £120,000 backing this thing, everybody just piled in, and away we went.
On the subject of co-founding really important organisations and lasting organisations around Cambridge, in your spare time, you also co-founded Cambridge Wireless in 2001, the same year you co-founded Cambridge Angels. I mean, obviously you've got that original telecoms background, but what was the opportunity that you felt that Cambridge Wireless could address?
Many years ago, before we had broadband, I discovered that Cambridge was not on the list for the first rollout of broadband-connected cities. As it happened, I was then doing some work with the then Prime Minister, a certain Tony Blair, and I got inserted into Tony Blair's speech in Cambridge when he came up to launch a report that I had authored, a commitment from BT to roll out broadband in Cambridge. And I'd done the deal on that one sitting in restaurant 22, as it happens, with a number of very senior people with BT and Alec Brewers. And I realised, after having done that if Cambridge was going to get the infrastructure it needed, because at that time, if Cambridge didn't have broadband, what on earth was what was going on? And we were about to enter a new wave of 3G. Of course, 3G is now nothing like this thing you need to run your smartphone, but 3G was the bee's knees, as it were. It was the cutting edge at that time. So we formed Cambridge 3G in order to create this marketing presence, right? To then encourage operators to deploy 3G in Cambridge early. And we did. We had the first base stations outside of the test beds in the Thames Valley came to Cambridge because of Cambridge 3G. When 3G rolled out, of course, we changed our name to Cambridge Wireless, but that's another story. But that was all engineered between myself and Jack Lang to shift all of that. That came out of a very specific need, having learned the lesson of, for heaven's sake, we need infrastructure in Cambridge if we're going to stay right at the leading edge.
And as we said, Cambridge Wireless has remained a really important organisation locally. One of the organisers of Cambridge Tech Week, the primary organiser of Cambridge Tech Week, and they also operate the 5G test beds. That legacy continues.
Yes, and I'm very proud of what Cambridge Wireless is doing. I was chair for a significant amount of time, and occasionally still come back and ask me for a little bit of advice.
Is it that a bit of a double-edged sword sometimes in the fact that, with Cambridge Network, you sat on their board and then you left and then you went back and sat on it again, and, they will constantly, I assume, come and pick your brains as being one of the original co-founders?
Faye, I don't mind that, coming back and asking me questions, as long as, I'm not encumbered. Being a formal chair role is a big job, right? Being an occasional advisor, before I came to do this podcast, I was sitting over there and giving some old mates from Cambridge Wireless some advice, right? That's fine. I'm very happy to do that.
Perfect. So just on a broader Cambridge conversation, and I don't want to talk policy now, so I'm talking very specifically for the tech ecosystem. We've got Innovate Cambridge that's just launched. We had the summit a few weeks ago. We're now developing the tech strategy for Innovate Cambridge. What do you think we need to be doing to keep Cambridge highly competitive moving forward from a tech point of view?
I think we need to have a collective view about what scale means. I'd say that scale as it has happened in Silicon Valley is absolutely not the model we want to follow. And I think we need to understand that the chance encounters that lead to really great ideas only happen if you have organisations and structures that enable them to happen. We're sitting in the Bradfield Centre, and I had 3 meetings as part of an informal committee with Trinity about how to design this place and how it ought to operate in order that it would maximise the amount of serendipitous encounters. And when you walk into this place, you can see it does work. It really does. I mean, I walked in today and I saw loads of people I knew. We need to be thinking about that at scale. And the tech community needs to understand that it doesn't operate in isolation from that spatial and social environment in which it sits.
Yeah, no, I think that that's really, really important. And it kind of is a nice segue into the next bit. So still a little bit on Cambridge, but in terms of the charitable contribution as well, which is quite specific, but it's something that you're very passionate about. And I know that you've mentioned it already, and that's Cambridge Science Centre, another thing that you co-founded, you really got off the ground. Tell us a little bit about why that charitable element has been so important to you.
If you make some money, I think you really ought to give back to the community. I think that everybody needs to be a good citizen. The old line that a society grows great where people plant trees whose shade they will never sit under is really important. And so I think that's what drives me for all of those things. I look back on my life and see all the chances and opportunities that I got. And I think that really other people ought to have those as well, because, how else are we going to prosper?
And on that kind of vein, you've been heavily involved with Raspberry Pi and the Raspberry Pi Foundation. Again, I mean, we've covered them a lot on the podcast. They've obviously recently floated. You must be incredibly proud of what they've achieved over the years. Can you kind of go into your involvement with the organisation and how you've helped shape that?
Yeah, well, there's another bit of, I suppose, serendipity. Raspberry Pi came to Cambridge Angels, and some unsung heroes put money in, people like Robert Sansom. And Jack Lang, of course, actually reasonably well known for his contribution to Raspberry Pi. As it got off the ground, they decided that they were going to need a proper board to run the company. That is the company that produces the pies. And so they asked Herman, Sherry Kutu, and myself to join. And as Sherry said to me, when you get an invitation from Raspberry Pi like that, you're not going to refuse, are you? So we all three of us joined the board. The charity was a separate organisation. The charity at that point owned 100% of the trading company. We sat on the trading company board and, I made my contributions. And then David Brabham was asked by the charity trustees to take me out for a rather nice lunch at Japas, Japanese restaurant, and asked me if I would like to become chair. Not only chair of the trading company, but also chair of the charity. And again, following Sherry's line, how could I refuse? When I took over, I don't know, a dozen people, maybe a little more in the entire organisation. And the charity didn't have a proper business model. It was one of those things where we're giving money away to good causes. We must be doing good things. Well, my book, a charity has to be run just like a business. You have to understand exactly what you're doing, what you're trying to achieve, and you have to make every single penny count in order to be able to do that. So I did a number of things, reorganizing what was going on. I was involved in all the technical strategy discussions about the development of the pies, as well as the strategy for how to develop the foundation. And in about 2016, I held an off-site at our house in Italy, involving the then chief executive of the foundation, Philip Colligan, and the chief executive of the trading company, Eben Upton. And we had a couple of days of strategizing in temperatures that got up to about 37 degrees centigrade at times. It got quite hot. Not the discussion, but just the actual temperature. And there was one point where I had a chat with Eben sitting in the car in our car park, and I agreed how we were going to do the structure for the flotation. And that gives you some idea, I think, about how far in advance you need to do things. I'd been engaged with obviously the Board of Trustees, but also a wonderful lawyer called Louis Glass, who had helped put together the Articles of Association, revamping everything, revamping the governance structure. I introduced a thing called the Raspberry Pi members. So the idea is that there are members of the charity and they elect the Board of Trustees. And the important point about that is if you can convince a membership of 30, 40, 50 people to do something, then you're probably right. right? You have to have these democratic controls, proper governance structures in place to be able to make things work. So I did all of those things. I did a lot of some of the stuff about the plumbing, to make the whole thing work, as well as doing the negotiations and laying the thing out. So I was absolutely delighted. We were going to, flotation, to be frank, had been discussed all the time when I was, not quite all the time I was chair, but a lot of it. And when I stepped down as chair, I was slightly disappointed. I mean, I'd already written in the fact that I had to step down as chair at the end of 6 years. So that's fine. I'd done that myself. And it's a very good thing, very good principle about organisations. Don't hang around too long. Of course, it was going to take some time before we could get to flotation. So I wasn't going to see that. But I'm absolutely delighted that the groundwork proved to be the right groundwork.
So how many years was it from that conversation in the car through to the flotation happening?
8 years.
8 years. Right, okay, yeah.
That's fairly typical, James. I think people have this idea that somehow, you have a conversation and then things, next week. I mean, when I set up ABCAM, I didn't let a moment lose. Jonathan originally said, I'll get back to you in a few weeks. I said, no, we're going to meet this Saturday. That was from meeting him on the Monday, I think. I said, well, we're going to meet on Saturday. Some things you have to do really, really quickly. But where you're doing long-term strategy like that, you've got to accept that these things are going to take years to come to fruition. What you want to be in a position of, when they happen, you want to say to yourself, I'm really glad I did all those things 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 8 years ago, because that has enabled us to do what we're doing now.
I think it's a really interesting point as well, though, because I agree with you that if you're sitting on a board, there is a natural time when you need to move on from the board and get new people and new opinions in. But it's also quite hard because you've done that work and, things may not carry on quite the same way. So, but that I guess that's just nature of the position, isn't it?
On the other hand, Faye, if you've done a good job with a good strategy that's solid and you have got the board to agree, okay, other people coming in may vary things a little bit away from it, but it ought to be fairly robust.
Yeah. So I'm going to move us on in the conversation now. Thinking of good strategy and good policy, let's talk about public policy and government, shall we? So we talked in the first part of your recording about the budget. You've always been extremely involved in public policy and the relationship with government locally, nationally. Not just technology, but actually, like you talked about in the first part, what does it actually mean to us as residents in terms of decisions that are made? So what I'd like to do is get, you're like supremely busy and you still manage to do all of those things. Why for you is it so important that you are actively involved? And what are some of those key moments that you can look back on and say, that's what I've done in the area of public policy?
As far as public policy is concerned, I think the issue that I have is that I see gaps. And I suppose that's the entrepreneur in me. I can't see a gap without thinking, how do I fill that? What's the opportunity? And the gap in particular that I see with Cambridge and its growth is quite simple, really. If you've got something which is growing and doubling in size every 10 years, it's very difficult for people to recognise that you're twice as big after 10 years, you're 4 times as big after 20 years, you're 8 times as big after 30 years. Now, I've lived in Cambridge for more than 30 years. If I projected it ahead, I'm unlikely to live another 30 years, but 8 times the current size? And I don't want us sleepwalking into disaster, and it would be a disaster. Something of that kind of scale, if we don't think about it really carefully, there's a good chance of not being a very nice place to be. The corresponding thing, when I put the terms of reference together for the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Independent Economic Review and help put that together and raise the funding and so on, and doing that with Cambridge Ahead, the fundamental point there was to say, look, let's look into the future. Let's see how this stuff is going. I was really going back to my time with the Long Range Studies Division, where I started my first proper job, even though I didn't treat it quite like a proper job, to be honest, but still. that needs to be thought about. It's very difficult for people to understand how to coordinate transport and electricity and water and health and education, and to do that in a circumstance where things are growing really fast. At first, when I got involved in all of this, it was all exciting, and I got involved with e-commerce and government policy. I was on one of the boards of the Ministry of Defence. I helped write the government white paper on communications, which brought about Ofcom, all those kinds of things. They're very interesting. But then actually in the place that you live, and you can see how it's developing, and you can see that this stuff is going to happen at rates of change that people have never encountered, you feel there's a real obligation to do something about it. I suppose I'm an instinctive chairman. Basically, right, everybody, we need to get together to be able to address this particular problem, because you might not see it now. You might just think that it's a queue for the traffic along East Road. You have seen nothing compared to what's coming down the pike at you.
It's a huge conversation in itself. Maybe we should get you back to do a whole episode on that too.
Part 3.
Yeah, part 3. These parts could just keep going on and on, couldn't they? But, that's why, as well as founding companies and these, networking organisations, you've also done, like you said, you're a chair at heart, so Cambridge Ahead, you've just mentioned, Centre for Science and Policy. You've done all of those things as well to actually tangibly do something and show progress in these areas.
Yeah, the Centre for Science and Policy is an interesting one, because I was given a budget of about £1.6 million by the university and asked to create an institute. And of course, the academics wanted me to spend money on research reports, which they would then use to tell policymakers, who the academics considered to be interesting people, but rather ill-advised and ill-informed, about what the eternal truth was as a result of this research report. Never struck me as being the right way to do it. Having operated in government and having operated in academia, everybody has their place. I suppose there's a kind of underlying need to respect everybody. Going back to this point about being a chair, I designed, in conversation, as a chance conversation with Arnaud Demer, who was then head of the judge, I had some vague inklings, but I designed a system whereby people from Whitehall could come and have 31-hour meetings with experts in Cambridge on a series of topics that they were interested in, or questions that they wanted answered. And the result is that there's now been about 14,000 meetings between people from Whitehall and people in Cambridge. And we've had over 600 of these fellows through. Cambridge is now the best networked university with government that there is in the United Kingdom. And that was the strategy. It was to use what I'd understood with Cambridge Network and with Cambridge Wireless and the way that Cambridge Angels had worked, to then actually turn that into something operational, so that you would actually then deliver something which was going to be completely unexpected. Various other universities have now copied the idea. When I did it, nobody had done it.
If you are a startup looking to grow in Cambridge, the Bradfield Centre offers a range of flexible membership packages which put you in control of your office and home working mix. There's a vibrant, collaborative atmosphere, on-site cafe, plenty of green outside space, and regular member social events. We also offer a range of high-quality meeting spaces for hire, and for tech event organisers, our auditorium, lakeside pavilion, and atrium spaces are perfect to bring your communities together for in-person and hybrid events. For more information, visit bradfieldcentre.com or call 01223 919 600.
We spent a little bit of time there talking specifically about policy in regards to Cambridge. If we can now spend a little bit of time looking globally, where do you think the UK ranks in terms of its investment and the support for areas like semiconductors, quantum, and, say, forming regulatory frameworks for AI?
I think the UK in general has a rather unhealthy obsession with science. It thinks that somehow the high priests of science are going to be able to deliver prosperity. And you can compare and contrast that with the United States, where Edison And that culture is the primary driver, so-called Yankee ingenuity. There is a profound difference between the two. One, on our side of the pond, a kind of unwavering respect for the intellectual powerhouse, and on the other side of the pond, a real enthusiasm for the practical implementation and consequences. And that difference is the problem for us.
So that's provocative. What do we do about it? And what are the ramifications of those two different approaches?
So one of my other things that I do in my spare time is I have a scheme with the Royal Academy of Engineering, where I'm a fellow, which is a policy fellowship scheme, largely modelled on the Centre for Science and Policy, where I'm getting people in from Whitehall to spend time with engineers, not just all experts, and understand how engineers think about problems. The issue that we have in the United Kingdom is that we do not have a chief engineer. We have a chief scientist. We do not have a chief engineer. We have a chief technology officer, by the way, but that's to do with people's views about webby stuff and IT. Let's talk about proper engineering, because HS2, Terminal 5, Channel Tunnel, all of these things, the changeover to green energy, all of these things are going to require engineering. The AstraZeneca vaccine, brilliant in terms of science, but 98%, as Pascal Soriot from AstraZeneca said, the majority of the effort was engineering. It wasn't science. Because if you're going to make vaccine at scale and you're going to deliver it, that's engineering. It's not science. In the UK, unlike in America or in Germany, or probably more importantly for the long run for us in China, they think engineering is really important, and engineers play a massive role in government and in policy. Over here, you're dismissed as an engineer because basically you're going to come around and fix the gas boiler. There is a very serious problem in the United Kingdom about how engineering is thought of. I'm doing my little bit with the Royal Academy of Engineering to try and change it. Over time, I'm hoping it's going to shift, but we'll have to see. The UK needs to get out of its view that somehow inventing something is the same thing as innovation. I had this discussion at a parliamentary committee. I was called as an expert witness. And I listened to all the speakers coming in, and when I was asked the question about what I thought about this new proposal for a thing called ARIA, which was the Advanced Invention and Research Agency, all this stuff to do with somehow the intellectual bit of this being the important thing. And I said, look, all I've heard so far in this parliamentary committee is people talking about two things. They talk about engineering and they talk about projects. So I would like to call it the Advanced Research and Engineering Projects Agency, because that's what ARPA is over in the United States. They come from that Edison heritage of doing things, of implementing things, not just talking about it. Actually, it turned out that the opposition then put a motion in to change the name of the bill to my suggestion, which was very amusing, but was rejected by the then science minister because she said that she rather liked the name ARIA. Now, my problem with this is that invention for me conjures up a black and white film of a middle-aged man in a tweed jacket emerging from a shed with his head on fire, clutching a test tube, right? Innovation is a rather different matter. Innovation is about an entire supply chain, about how you actually get this stuff into the hands of people.
Massively thought-provoking stuff. I don't know where to go with all of that, but I think you're right. It's you can have ideas, but you've got to be able to execute them. And that's the bit that we're kind of missing. And I think about people like, it's great to see Poppy Gustafson now being investment director. We're starting to get the right people in. So I hope that the work you're doing is going to start tackling some of that as well. But I'm going to move us on because I'm also very conscious of your time. And I want to get through this last, which actually I think is a really critical section. So as we wrap the discussion up, I would would like to talk to you about your long-held views on serendipity. And I would actually say our relationship came as a result of exactly what we're about to talk about. And just as an example, we were introduced by Anne Fisher 10 years ago in 2014. And your advice has literally been the bedrock of my whole approach within Cofinitiv. And then I don't know if you remember this, you immediately on meeting me went, Faye, you've got to go and speak to Jane at Cambridge Ahead, and you've got to help because we've got this technology advisory group. Go do that, and it'll work out for you. And that was basically it. That was kind of my main introduction into Cambridge. And we've worked on lots of things over the years, one of them being the Impulse programme, and we referred to this earlier on. And the strapline for Impulse, which I think you were behind, is where chance encounters happen. So just tell us the gist of serendipity and what it has meant to you.
So serendipity means good fortune happens if you try. And it derives from the land of serendipitous, happy chance, happy coincidence, Sri Lanka, Ceylon, as was in the old days. Serendipity is something that once you've noticed it happening, you realise that it's absolutely everywhere in your life and will be the thing that determines what path your career and social life and everything else takes. It's all chance. Because I'm an engineer at heart. How do I turn that knowledge into something that can actually deliver something useful? And it turns out that whilst I've experimented with things like Cambridge Wireless and Cambridge Network and Cambridge Angels and CSAP and all these other things, it really has occurred to me that when we look at the way in which we're generating ideas in society, in the economy, and then actually turning them into useful product. There's a step which is the step of how do you get the right people to talk to the right people so that something can happen. We do that in Cambridge extraordinarily well. A lot of the stuff where I've managed to do things in Cambridge have been through those chance encounters and those kinds of discussions, raising money or having new ideas or whatever else it is. So the question really here is, can you operationalize it? And there's an example of how that was turned into something practical in the late 18th century. And the Lunar Society was a society that was formed by people like Wedgwood and Bolton. And their idea was that they would come together at the full moon, because that's when you could travel on horseback during the evening, hence the Lunar Society, and you would discuss the latest scientific and other ideas, including art as well as science. I'm a great believer in this crossover. Just doing science or just doing engineering doesn't cut it. We live a holistic existence. You cannot do it solely by looking at one discipline. They took the same kind of approach. And as a result, I'll give you a couple of examples. One was there was somebody who you would now describe as being on the spectrum, a chap called James Watt, who was then introduced and managed to get enough resources so that he could build a thing called a steam engine, or rather, he took the Newcomen engine and he had an idea for how to make it much more efficient. And he had his governor, which allowed you to regulate how fast the steam engine would work. What would never have got that without the Lunar Society. And as part of that extended network, there was a chap called Stevenson, who as a young man approached one of the other members of the Lunar Society and said, I've got a great idea for how to put Watt's engine onto steel rails and actually make it move up and down and pull things. And that's how we got the steam engine. We forget that in order to drive proper innovation, we need to have these structures in place. And this serendipity, my book, which I'm going to be releasing shortly, is called Serendipity. It doesn't happen by accident. And it doesn't happen by accident. Of course, there's chance involved. I'm not going to guarantee when I walk down the street or I'm cycling in Cambridge, I'm going to bump into somebody who's going to change the complete direction of my life. But I can change the probabilities of that happening. And the insight that I think I bring on this is that we can construct networks, as we've done with Cambridge Network, as we did with Cambridge Angels and all the other things that I've done, we could construct networks that raise the probability of those chance encounters. You quoted the Impulse program. These chance encounters lead to great things, right? It was indeed my strapline. I can't remember it exactly word for word, I'm afraid, anymore, but that's not the point. It's basically you engineer the opportunity for these chance encounters and great things would happen. It's a missing part of the infrastructure of the UK. Going back to industrial strategy and where we get to, I think we need to put in place organisational structures similar to my Policy Fellows programme at Cambridge and Royal Academy of Engineering, that will enable those interactions to take place. They will seemingly be random, but they will shift the probability. In the same way as I put two chemicals into a flask and they react very slowly, but if I put a catalyst in there, they will react really quickly. Because the catalyst gives you the surface by which the molecules can actually meet and do their thing.
That's serendipity. So perfect. Thank you.
And was that an exclusive with the book title there? Was that an exclusive for the podcast? Did we just hear that?
It's an exclusive at the moment.
Well, we'll get you back on for the book launch. We'll get you back on. Thank you. We've covered so much there. My last question, but I think you're just going to laugh at me for asking, is I remember a long time ago, or certainly pre-COVID, we had a conversation where you sat opposite me and you said, I'm definitely going to stop some of these commitments. I'm going to start winding a few things down. How is that working out for you, David?
It's working out very well, Faye. I'm not doing anything like the amount that I used to do. I mean, I took my grandson snowboarding at Milton Keynes yesterday for the entire day. It's not something I would have contemplated being possible when we had that conversation. No, I have written out plans for how I've done that. Stepped down from Raspberry Pi, stepped down as chair of Cambridge Science Centre. I've got two major companies that I'm chair of, Focal Point Positioning here in Cambridge, and Chemify, which is based up in Glasgow, which is the most amazing, fascinating company you will ever come across. We have a general purpose machine for manufacturing any molecule. It is going to completely revolutionise chemistry and biochemistry. Those things are really important for me. I have gone along with Cambridge Ahead, with the chair of the policy group, because that's really dear to my heart, as we've covered in the podcast. But generally, I'm trying to find enough time to finish off this blooming book and get it published before Christmas. I'm managing more time with the grandkids, which is great. And that's probably the most important thing.
Yeah. Well, that's great to hear. So thank you so much for being with us today and covering these 2 episodes.
Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much indeed, chaps. I've really enjoyed it.
We really hope you've enjoyed these 2 episodes, and if you're still eager for even more David Cleevely, then tune into episode 146, where David talks about his book, Serendipity, It Doesn't Happen by Accident.
Join us next week when we talk to Corrosion Radar CEO Shiraz Enonsur, which is also available in video format as well as audio.
Today's show was produced by Carl Homer of Cambridge TV and supported by our media partner, Business Weekly. The Cambridge Tech Podcast is available on all major podcast platforms and on cambridgetechpodcast.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please give it a 5-star review. It'll really help others discover the show.